Chapter 22, Section 2 deals with some environmental issues. The first being air pollution, which can be in different forms. One with smog, which is when water vapor gets mixed with human-made chemicals, such as fossil fuels. You've got CFCs, which we've discussed before, and how those cause the ozone layer to thin. And then with that comes global warming, the greenhouse effect, again attributed a lot to an increase in carbon dioxide levels. And then there's acid precipitation. So not just necessarily acid rain, but it could also be, in snow or sleet form as well. So acid precipitation is when air pollutants actually combine with water. And then there's also land and water pollution, and we'll discuss something called biological magnification, which is where chemicals actually become more concentrated in organisms higher on the food chain. So on those lower than those organisms on the food chain, there's small amounts, but the ones higher on the food chain have to eat so much that you're going to see larger concentrations of those chemicals within those big organisms. Some disruptions to the ecosystem can cause all sorts of things. One of those being extinction, which is where all the members of a species goes extinct or dies. Before that point, we try to identify organisms as endangered species, at which point they're put on a watch list and usually there are, bans in hunting them, and they sometimes try to capture some of these organisms to breed them in captivity and then later release them to the wild, so that we can try to repopulate some of those endangered species. And then there are things called ecosystem imbalances. And with those, one of the key species that we'll be looking at is called a keystone species, and that's one that affects many other species in the community. So if you were looking at a food web, this one would have lots of connections in that web. The book discusses the sea otter and how the sea otter normally eats sea urchin, some other small invertebrates and fish. And at a point in time, they were being overhunted, so their numbers were very low. And then the sea urchin population grew way more than usual and ate more of the kelp than it would normally do. And it causes all these different imbalances in what was a normally pretty stable environment. So that keystone species is one that scientists will tend to look at first in identifying what sort of changes are going on in the environment. And then just some resources that humans use. One thing is called primary production, and this is the total energy that can be stored through photosynthesis by terrestrial organisms. And then we have our ecological footprint. You might have heard of that before. That's our actual human impact on the ecosystem. And as populations increase, so do the use of that energy. And then sustainability refers to the ability for us to meet human needs so that the population can survive indefinitely. So the goal here then would be to close the gap between how much energy that we're using and what we actually need. So whether that's developing new technologies for energy, whether that's trying to slow down the actual growth rate of the human population, or whether we all just kind of reduce some of the resources that we're using.